This episode of Dispatches from Planet Albany is brought to you with support by New York State United Teachers, which represents more than 600,000 educators and school-related professionals in New York. Dispatches is also supported by the public affairs firm O'Donnell & Associates. For more information, check out o'donnellsolutions.com.
Senator Roxanne Persaud. Excuse me. Oh, you know what? It's not Senator Roxanne Persaud. They keep pointing me to other people, and I just get it wrong. So we're going to try for Senator Brisport.
It's okay, Madam Chair. People confuse us all the time.
Touche.
You all look the same.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of D.C., and Eddie Vedder comes out. And he goes, "You have a cigarette?" And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is Dispatches from Planet Albany, a podcast about power and policy in New York State government. And on this episode, we're exploring redistricting, including the efforts to redraw the state's congressional boundaries before 2032, and the more traditional work of making new lines after the census, with the future ambiguity stemming from an ongoing court case, as well as a potential constitutional amendment. To get an update on where things stand and where things could go, we're joined by Jeff Wice, a senior fellow and distinguished adjunct professor with the New York Law School's Census and Redistricting Institute, and who was previously, in another life, the Redistricting Counsel to state Democratic legislative leaders. Thanks for making the time, Jeff.
A pleasure to be with you, David.
Well, before we get into the latest and ongoing developments, I want to tap into your institutional memory. Are there previous decades in between the traditional redistricting where there was this much turmoil about congressional lines and how they would be drawn in the future? Does anything come to mind as you think, and I apologize for dating you, your multiple decades in this space?
Well, I'll predate myself by mentioning that in the 1960s, after the U.S. Supreme Court handed down the historic Baker versus Carr decision that set the motion in place for one person, one vote, nearly every state had to redraw its district lines to comport with population equality requirements. And New York ended up redrawing its map almost every year in mid-decade in the 1960s. At one point, the Assembly increased its membership from 150 to 200, and the court said, no, you can't do that. And I believe back in 1966 or 67, a number of legislators either lost their seats in the lower house or had to run against each other. In 1997, which does date me, there was a case, Diaz versus Silver, that challenged what's now the Nydia Velázquez congressional district as a racial gerrymander, and the federal courts rejected the map as being overly based on race, but the only real outcome was that the district was reshaped, but Congressmember Velázquez kept her district, and of course she's now served in Congress well over 30 years. But outside of the 1960s, the 1990s, we haven't seen any mid-decade redistricting in New York.
Yeah, this definitely feels new to the people who maybe don't have your breadth of experience. And the closest I can get to it is the aftermath of the redistricting in 2010-2012 when former New York City Mayor Ed Koch was pushing what eventually became the system we have now. But that was still a wait and see until 2020 problem. But I mentioned the ongoing court case, and I say ongoing because while an acting state Supreme Court judge with close ties to the Senate Dems and Governor Hochul has found that the 11th Congressional District, which includes Staten Island and parts of Brooklyn, continues a pattern of, quote, discrimination against minority voters, and called for the state's redistricting commission to redraw the district maps, I can't imagine any steps being formally taken until the state's top court, the Court of Appeals, weighs in on this. Is that how you see this playing out, or is there a world in which you think this issue doesn't make it to New York's top court?
Well, it's going to make it to New York's top court, but it might actually make it to the nation's top court before then. We're literally on a day-to-day basis waiting to see what the courts do. First, we have the judge's decision at the trial court level. Justice Perlman in New York County decided that the 11th congressional district violated the state's constitution ban on racial discrimination in certain circumstances. So that case is now on appeal to both the appellate division and to the higher court, the State Court of Appeals. And we're waiting to today, February 9th. The Republican reply briefs are due on whether or not a stay or a hold put on the decision should stay in place. And at the same time, the State Court of Appeals is trying to figure out whether they even have jurisdiction at this point. And on top of that, the Republicans have indicated that if the state courts don't provide any direction on where this case is going by tomorrow or midweek of this week, then they're going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, which has its own set of rules on how to deal with changing maps too close to an election.
Well, we spoke with the New York State Democratic Party Chair, Jay Jacobs, about the potential fallout from this and whether he anticipated redrawing one congressional district's boundaries, if that is how this plays out, whether that would impact the rest of the state's boundaries or just the neighboring congressional districts. And he thought it would just be the neighboring congressional district that would be impacted. What's your expectations if this does go down that route? Is it going to be something that impacts a broader swath of the state, or is it just the neighboring congressional district?
If the plaintiffs are successful in getting the map redrawn, one option is simply to redraw the 11th district and swap population with the current 10th district. But that was an option presented to Justice Perlman by the Democratic plaintiffs. He didn't accept that map. He didn't reject it either, but directed the State Redistricting Commission to draw the map as they see fit. And they could change other lines as well. Then again, they might never get a chance to redraw the lines. And there's also an outside possibility that if the case goes the way the plaintiffs want it to go, and with time running out before petitioning begins on February 24th, even a special master could be brought in to draw the map. There are lots of different options at this point, but it's hard to tell until we see what exactly the courts are going to do.
Well, what does the future timeline potentially look like if, say, the State Court of Appeals weighs in on this? Is this something where we should anticipate that they hear a case and issue a ruling in days, and thus the February 24th petitioning process could potentially start on schedule for these impacted districts? Or is this something that will likely impact the election calendar if the boundaries are redrawn?
Well, at this point, petitioning for this year's spring primary is supposed to start on February 24th.
Yeah, 2 weeks from now.
And the Democratic State Board of Elections Commission co-director indicated to the courts that a new map could be in place as late as a day or two before February 24th. So in that sense, there's still some time. The Republicans at the state board disagree. They told the court that a deadline for a new map out of the commission was last Friday, February 6th. So, a lot depends to see on what the courts do and when they decide. And then if it's getting down to the wire or past February 24th, I'm not saying this will happen, but conceivably the state legislature could step in and change the petitioning process as it did in 2022.
Are there any tea leaves to read that might give us some sort of insight into how the State Court of Appeals might handle this case if it does presumably reach them?
Well, the tea leaves are that the clock is ticking. Basically, The State Court of Appeals is a much different one than we had in 2022
Sure.
when the legislature's maps were struck down. But the real wild card here is to see whether or not the Republicans, Congressmember Meliotakis and her, her co-interveners, go to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the U.S. Supreme Court, if it could be convinced to accept this case on an emergency basis, could rule under what's called the Purcell Doctrine in federal courts, and that's where federal courts do not want to get engaged in changing maps too close to a deadline. So the Supreme Court, could step in and say, look, it's already early February. Petitioning starts in late February. There's simply no time to draw a new map should the plaintiffs prevail back in state court. Therefore, they're going to prevent the use of any new map. It's really up in the air, but this is what the Republicans have indicated their strategy might be to bring this into federal court if the state courts don't resolve the issue.
Well, that argument sounds like one that would be attractive to the conservative majority on the U.S. Supreme Court, because it sounds like they wouldn't have to weigh in on the merits of this case or get too deeply involved in any sort of precedent-setting issue, and they could essentially just kick the can down the road. I mean, is that how you would interpret that?
Well, when we look at recent U.S. Supreme Court action coming out of Texas and California, the court rejected a Texas challenge that sought to throw out the new map that was enacted last year. They said it's simply too late at this point to hear a case challenging a new map. Therefore, the Republican gerrymandered map will go into place for this year's election. Similarly, just last week in California, where the state enacted a new map ostensibly to knock out a few Republicans, the Supreme Court said it's too late at this point for us to weigh in. The state law shall stand. So, the court has spoken on behalf of both parties, so to speak, in the last few weeks.
Although I would argue they've ruled in favor of the status quo, whereas this case would change up boundaries, and I could see the logical extension of those previous rulings being there's no time to redraw lines now.
Yeah, there's no new map right now drawn for District 11 to look to. The current map is the one the legislature enacted in 2024, and that's currently the map that petitioning will start with, unless there's a new map in place before then, or the courts or legislature determine otherwise. It's really a bit of a wait and see. We're really in suspended animation on this, waiting for the next steps to happen.
And in terms of potential next steps, there's the state's bipartisan redistricting commission, and that's what we call it here on the Dispatches from Planet Albany show, because we won't use the independent branding. But
I call it so-called independent.
Excellent. We appreciate that level of skepticism. And they've had some changes in recent years, in part because a commissioner died, and Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie appointed a new commissioner in late January. But aside from that activity, is there anything that suggests the commission is in a place to convene and draw up new boundaries in an expedited way, and in a way that could get any sort of majority support from the commissioners? Have they indicated in any way, shape, or form that they are primed for the pump, so to speak?
Well, the commission now has a full complement of 10 members, arguably 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and no tie-breaking odd number chair or other member. But at this point, the commission is enjoined or prevented from doing anything. Now, if they do meet, the question becomes, can they do anything? And that's something we have to wait and find out. In 2023 and 2024, they were able to come together in a bipartisan manner in the Assembly and the Senate to redraw the congressional and assembly maps. But here we're looking at a different scenario where Republican members are being asked to redraw a district that could eliminate a Republican member of Congress. And we haven't heard from them yet, but it's an excellent question to pose as to whether or not they're going to agree, or whether they're going to be able to agree on the map despite how hard they might try, and come up in a stalemate if they ever do meet.
Do they have any money, though, to even get to work on new maps? Is there an appropriation out there that you're aware of that they could turn to?
The commission has been funded each year by the legislature, so they have the resources to do the work. They actually have staff in place, in Manhattan and Albany.
And based on the current makeup of the commission, is there anything that you can read into how they might approach this work? Because I think about somebody like Ken Jenkins, who is the top Democrat on this effort, and he is, I would say, very partisan. We've spoken with Charlie Nesbitt, who was previously the Assembly minority leader, so he's a Republican, and I don't know how much skin he has in the game at this point, but is there any reason to think that this is going to shake out in some sort of kumbaya moment by the commission if they are called off the bench?
Well, Ken Jenkins and Charlie Nesbitt have an excellent working relationship. They work well together. They respect each other. And I think they could work together towards a new map. The question really is whether there are 5 Republican votes to change a map that, in their view, can simply help the Democrats. And that's a question we just have to wait and see. They could be, if the courts permit them to go back to work, they could meet. They can try to come up with a map. They can try as hard as they can, but end up being where they were back in 2021, 2022, sending the legislature competing maps. And since they can't go to work now because of the court stay, then we don't know what those maps might even look like yet.
And there's a process that spells out what happens if the Redistricting Commission submits lines, the legislature doesn't like them. But is there any expectation about what that process would look like in this case if the Redistricting Commission either submits lines or is unable to submit lines? Is there an expectation that you fall back on what's been happening in the past, or because this is uncharted territory, do we not really know what to expect?
It's hard to know what to expect right now. The state constitution is clear and it's confusing. In one paragraph, the Constitution says that should a court reject the map for any reason during the decade, that the state legislature shall have the responsibility to fix it, to develop a new map. 2 paragraphs down, the Constitution says that in the event that a new map is needed because of a legal challenge, there shall be a commission in place to redraw the map, period. So it's got separate paragraphs indicating that there's a role for the commission and there's a role for the legislature. Now, the judge's decision, Justice Perlman's decision, simply said that the commission had to have a new map by February 6th, period. That didn't happen, and he didn't indicate next steps. The Democrats asked the court to please convene a status conference to discuss the next steps, but we haven't heard from the court. So we do expect this week to hear something from the appellate division on the status of the stay and the future next steps as to where this is going and when.
Some challenges need someone who simply won't quit. Modern Advocacy brings tenacity, strategy, and unwavering follow-through to every client it serves. Learn more at modernadvocacyllc.com. Well, let's turn from one ambiguous situation to another, and that is the idea of overhauling the constitutional language that governs this whole process. There was a lot of attention to this in the fall of 2025. We even had visitors from Texas as the governor talked about the need to arm New York in response to what red states like Texas were doing. And there seems to be a lot less attention on this constitutional amendment process that, if I remember correctly, was spearheaded by Michael Asher in the Assembly and Mike Gianaris in the Senate. What's your sense of that effort right now? Because it doesn't need to get a vote today, tomorrow, or even a month from now. It just needs to get the ball rolling before the end of 2026. But do you have any sense or expectations about what the Democratic majorities might do on this issue?
My sense is that we first have to see what happens with the lawsuit over the 11th district. That's the first thing.
Why not go on parallel tracks? Why couldn't they just say this is a whole separate ball of wax and we'll just get things going on here regardless?
Because the legislature is focused on enacting a budget before April 1st.
You're saying they can't walk and chew gum at the same time, Jeff?
Well, they also are in session until June, so there is time to do this.
Right.
And I think they also want to see how things play out in Maryland, in Florida, in Virginia, a few other states considering mid-decade districting. But I do think that by the end of this session, by the late spring, early summer, we are going to see something out of the legislature dealing with redistricting, whether it's simply the Gianaris-Lasher amendment to permit mid-decade redistricting if any other state should do so in the future, or whether it's a rehaul of the constitutional amendment approved by the voters in 2014. I think that's likely. Remember, Governor Hochul indicated last summer that she wanted to abolish the commission. Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins has told us that she favors the commission, and Speaker Carl Hastie has said that something's got to change. We have to look at it. So I think we can expect action. Further, I think that the reform groups, the good government groups in the state, might suggest even a more independent process moving towards 2030. So I think we're going to see several proposals moving forward. I've got my ideas on how to do this in the future. I frankly think that I very much think the commission needs an overhaul. It's got an even number of members.
Right.
It's got schedules built in that can't work. The process imploded in 2021. There are a lot of shortcomings that are, that need to be fixed, shortcomings that were placed in the Constitution by then Governor Andrew Cuomo and the Senate Republican majority back in 2012,
with the support of the Assembly Democratic majority,
who supported it but weren't as active in trying to protect the then Republican coalition majority and the governor. And also remember that once the process did start to move in 2021, 2022, the governor tried to control the commission's staff, and that delayed things by a few months. So I think there's a lot that needs to be fixed in the current state constitutional revisions.
Well, you alluded to the dynamic that was at play more than a decade ago when this commission was crafted. We had this bipartisan split in our state government because there's one party Democratic rule and because no elected official has ever paid a penalty for really going against good government groups. Is there any reason to think that what emerges from a constitutional amendment is going to play out in the Democrats' favor?
Yeah, it's such a tough, it's a great question and a tough question because we don't know what's on the table yet. Further, any effort to change the Constitution has to go before the voters. And if you recall, the Democrats in 2021 put forward a constitutional amendment to change redistricting and other election law elements, and the Republicans outspent the Democrats. The Democrats really didn't spend any money on that.
Yeah, they sat on their hands.
And I think if we have an amendment before the voters in 2027, we're going to see a multi-million-dollar campaign on both sides. So any effort to amend the Constitution, isn't a sure bet. It's got to go through a long process, approval by the legislature this year, next year, then the voters, and that's still, I think, in an Albany lifetime, cycles away from now.
Well, reading between the lines then of that answer, it sounds like if there's anything that keeps the Democrats in the legislature in check when writing a constitutional amendment is this idea of, well, what can we get the voters to approve because they need that statewide referendum potentially in 2028?
That's true. And I think there are ways to develop a well thought out amendment, a better process, one that provides more balance, one that might even provide more independence for the commission. But I think the bottom line is that the legislature will probably want to retain control in the final end when maps get approved.
And I actually think I just made a mistake there. I said 2028. Potentially, this could come to the voters as early as 2027, right?
Well, the Gianaris-Lasher Amendment was developed last year with the goal to pass the current legislature in
Mm-hmm.
2026 and then have the same amendment passed early in 2027 by a newly elected legislature and then go to the voters in 2027 so that
Right.
if New York wanted to be in position to draw a new map in late mid-decade redistricting, it could do so for 2028.
I wonder how an odd year referendum might potentially benefit the Republicans in their effort to kill something like this, given how we see the ebbs and flows in Democratic turnout based on odd years, even years, presidential years,
Yeah,
midterm
well,
years.
that's a new twist
Right.
that the even year election law, could present, and something that we're, dealing with parallel tracks here in different years. So it's a great question. It's something that we don't know yet, but we do know that there will be a municipal election in New York City in 2027 with a large vote there. So whatever Republican gains might develop upstate New York or in the suburbs, you've also got New York City to deal with.
So at the same time, all of these changes are being considered. One thing I say we know for certain, but in this climate, maybe we don't know this for certain, is that there will be redistricting after the 2030 census. And the projections of some of the data recently released in 2026 is that New York is on track to lose 2 seats in Congress if the rate of population growth doesn't dramatically change, or all the other states potentially see a reversal in their positive population trends. What is on the table right now in New York to prepare for that census to ensure that as many New Yorkers as possible are actually counted?
Well, I'm pleased to say that New York might have a lot on the table in 2026 to prepare for 2030. Governor Hochul has included $3 million in her budget proposal for a census commission and a census assistance office in state government. In the legislature, Assembly members Mikhail Salages and Landon Dayas have a bill to allocate $15 million to create a commission and also a census assistance office. The bill is being carried by Senator Jeremy Cooney in the Senate. At the legislature's Aid to Localities hearing this week in Albany, there will be testimony presented in favor of a state census effort. New York lost one congressional district after the 2020 census by 89 people. That was a bizarre anomaly. Never happened before in recent history to any state. But New York learned a lesson that we've got to be well prepared. So, the money is needed for efforts next year in 2027 to help update census address lists, because the census forms in 2030 are sent to household addresses, not to names. So we have to really have a major state support effort to work with counties and cities and towns to update the Census Bureau's address lists. So I'm really very pleased that this year we're hopefully going to see state money in the budget to start organizing much earlier, because it's never too early to start, but eventually it's too late to catch up. And we learned that lesson after 2020.
Well, the other lesson I would take away from that past effort to prepare for the census was that you can lay something out, you can appoint people, but if the money doesn't flow, if those in power aren't aggressively doing this work, then the best intentions might not be realized. Is that a concern this go around? Is there reason to believe that we may see things play out the way we did with the what I'll call Governor Cuomo controlled census effort in the past, which there were people who weren't necessarily a huge fan of?
I would certainly hope not, that we don't see a replay of 2020. We are at a point now where money can be spent early on for meaningful, direct purposes, updating the address list, for instance. In 2020, the legislature appropriated, by my estimate, about $30 million for census outreach. Now, granted that COVID did hit the week the census started in March 2020, but the state at that point suspended all census outreach operations and then freed up about $5, 6, $7 million for assistance to counties to share with not-for-profit organizations in August and September of 2020, when it was almost too late. I spoke with county officials in several states that couldn't even accept the money because of county budgeting and contracting requirements, that the opportunity in 2020 was really one that was missed, and New York paid the price for it.
Well, finally, anybody who's been listening to this interview or some of your past interviews acutely is going to notice that while they might be saying gerrymandering, you lean into the gerrymandering. Is that your plan moving forward? Are you sticking with the true Elbridge Gary pronunciation?
I'll tell you, in 1983, I went to a conference at the Kennedy Center at Harvard on post-1980 redistricting, and the counsel to the Republican National Committee made it a point to talk about the mistake in the pronunciation of the word gerrymander, that Elbridge was a Gary, not a Jerry, and that American folklore and usage has simply changed it somehow to gerrymandering. So Elbridge being a Gary, I don't think it's really a matter of Republicans versus Democrats picking one or the other, as was the argument 40 years ago. But I've trained myself, and I often fall back on the soft G, but I prefer to say gerrymandering. If I hear other people saying it, I've done something.
Well, we've been speaking with Jeff Wice. He is a senior fellow and distinguished adjunct professor with the New York Law School's Census and Redistricting Institute. Jeff, as always, thanks for lending us your time and expertise.
Thank you. On to 2030.
The analogy I make is to a baseball team. They have a great minor league system, strong sabermetrics department, good manager, but they don't have any players on the field. And that's the sad reality. My time is up. So, yeah. Go Mets.